Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 18, The First American Ponzi Scheme. I'm Brandon Seale. Sometime in the summer of 1535, four self-proclaimed medicine men presented themselves to a Native American village consisting of 50 or so lodges. The first of the four men was the most distinctive looking. His skin was dark brown, the color of a buffalo hide, and his hair and beard were darker even than that. By contrast, the other three were so pale and sunburned that they almost glowed, their skin flaking off them like a snake shedding its skin. The dark one in front started making hand signs and shouting as he drew closer. "We bring you good news," he gestured to the Native Americans. Maliacones, they called themselves. "We're the four medicine men you've heard about, performing great cures throughout this land." And indeed, the Maliacones had heard of this curious band of medicine men. But at the same time, they'd also started hearing stories about bearded demons appearing mysteriously on the edges of villages, performing their bad medicine, then leaving and taking with them everything the villagers owned. Mala cosa, they called this trickster medicine man. And so the Maliacones held back until they could be sure just who it was that had come to visit them. If truth be told, the four medicine men had plenty of misgivings themselves. Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Estevan believed that they were doing God's work in performing their cures, but deep down they'd begun to wonder. They were so overwhelmed by the power that they suddenly had that they began to mistrust it. And so several months ago, they had closed their ministry, so to speak, taking up work instead as artisans, making bows, arrows, and mats for the Indians amongst whom they were living. And they almost starved to death in the process. Being an artisan doesn't pay nearly as good as being a showman. And not only did the expeditionaries start to go hungry, they found themselves motionless, stuck, getting no closer to their final destination on the Rio Panuco. The contrast couldn't have been starker to their time as medicine men. In those first few heady months of their work as medicine men, in late 1534 and early 1535, they had won more status and advanced their journey further than anything else they had done in the almost 7 years that they'd been stuck here in North America. And so now, back in the summer of 1535, and stuck in South Texas, they knew what they needed to do. In Cabeza de Vaca's words, quote, "We commended ourselves to God," end quote, and went back on the road as medicine men. And now they had arrived here, at this 50-lodge village of the Maliacones. Estevan, out in front, eventually persuaded a few women and children to come forward and to see for themselves that the four medicine men meant no harm. Once they reached them, the women and children cautiously petted the four men like some kind of exotic animals, feeling their faces and bodies with their hands, checking perhaps to see if they were real or what kind of creatures they even were. Once the natives had convinced themselves that the four men were real, they invited these new arrivals into their village, gave them one night's rest, and then promptly presented them with a passel of their ailing tribesmen the next morning, quote, "begging us to bless them," end quote. It's unclear what specifically their ailment was, but there never seemed to be a shortage of natives in 1530s North America in need of spiritual healing. And so the four medicine men said their prayers, performed their routines, and made the sign of the cross. The implication in the text is that it worked. To show their gratitude, the natives presented the expeditionaries with baskets of prickly pears, a most welcome payment for these four men who had grown reaccustomed to hunger during the few months when they had stopped curing. And so they ate what they could right then and there, but then gave away all the rest to the other Maliacones around them. Word began to spread once again that the four mysterious medicine men were back at their game. And, quote, "while we were there with the Maliacones, others came from further ahead," end quote. This time, however, the expeditionaries resolved not to get bogged down and to keep their show mobile, always in search of new patients, new pastures, and forward progress. This came as a disappointment to the Maliacones, who enjoyed the prestige of having these great medicine men with them, and certainly enjoyed it when the medicine men gave away all their honorariums to the Maliacones. But over the tribe's tearful protests, the expeditionaries moved on. Just a few days later, the four arrived at a larger Native American village, this one with 100 lodges, certainly the largest that they'd seen since Florida, if ever. And the reception here was even warmer, suggesting that their reputations had begun to precede them. The villagers brought out all their children for the four medicine men to bless, and gave them gifts of mesquite flower. The four medicine men dutifully performed their cures, redistributed their gifts, and then moved on to the next village, leaving a bunch of very happy natives behind them. A few, perhaps, offered to guide the expeditionaries to the next village on what seems to have been some kind of established pre-Columbian trade route. It doesn't seem to me, though, that they really needed guides, because from this point on, the four expeditionaries can't travel more than a day or two without running into another village. And at each stop, the expeditionaries refined their routine further. First, they would send forward Estevan, who got everyone's attention with his unique appearance, and who always seemed to be able to communicate with the new peoples he encountered, despite the enormous variety of languages all around them. Then, the three Castilians came along behind him, playing their part. Cabeza de Vaca describes how he, Castillo, and Dorantes, quote, carried ourselves with gravity, and in order to maintain that, we said very little, end quote. And they didn't just walk up, lay hands on the afflicted, and shout, "Demons, come out." They performed mass-length, multi-hour rituals that enchanted their audiences, most of whom had probably never seen anything like it. Recall, too, that even the expeditionaries' form of prayer back in Old Castile would look unfamiliar to us today, and maybe a little bit New Agey. There was a strong emphasis at this time on the communal aspect of the exercise of faith. As Professor Gilbert Hinojosa reminded me, theirs was a pre-Reformation faith, premised much more on revealing the sacred in everything through ritual, rather than trying to make the mundane holy through liturgy. Services were characterized by much longer, repetitive prayers and extended cantations meant to induce a quasi-hypnotic state. Long pauses would have been left for self-reflection, spiritual contemplation, and the discernment of spirits. And through this ritual, there would have been no doubt to everyone involved, expeditionaries and native congregants alike, that they were communing with the divine during these moments. Soon after they had taken back up their ministry here in late summer of 1535, Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Estevan came upon a river whose waters came up to their chest, a river as wide as the Guadalquivir, they claimed. Most scholars think that this was the Rio Grande, on the border between modern Texas and Tamaulipas, near Lake Falcon perhaps, and just a few hundred miles now from their intended destination near modern-day Tampico. I get a little bit confused at this point in the narrative because I feel like they've been hanging around the north side of the Rio Grande for a while now. But this is the moment in late summer 1535 where I think the four expeditionaries actually cross it. As they were crossing the big river, some gourds floated down from somewhere upstream. The natives apparently held these to be items of special reverence, quote, "la cosa de mayor fiesta," end quote, believing that they, quote, came from the cielo, end quote, which, as you know, can mean sky or heaven in Spanish. It doesn't distinguish. While appreciating the blessing, the expeditionaries, of course, might have also drawn a different conclusion. The gourds were evidence of agriculture somewhere upstream. And agriculture meant settled, sedentary societies. And sedentary societies were the kinds of things that Castilians were always looking for. They took it as confirmation that they were on the right path and strapped the gourds around their waist as, quote, insignia of their authority, which indeed is what the natives believed them to be. And indeed, around this time, something changed in how the natives began to look at the four expeditionaries. Whereas before they had been creatures of suspicion or just novelty, now they became objects of real esteem. And the best proof of that growing esteem was in the number of Indians that attached themselves to the expeditionaries as a part of their entourage. Now, as the four moved between villages across the barren monte of northern Tamaulipas, dozens of Native Americans followed behind them. All of which was heightened by the religious ceremonies that they led once they established themselves in each new village. Ceremonies which were then further enhanced by the ritual ingestion of peyote, datura, fermented teas, and other intoxicants. Oftentimes, these rituals crossed over into the Bacchanalian, with drumming and dancing going late into the night, and always with the faint threat of turning violent at any moment. Actually, Cabeza de Vaca tells us how the women often retreated to the periphery during these ceremonies, fearful of provoking the drunken fury of any of the men. And as the nights wore on, the expeditionaries tended to follow the women's example, retreating as well back to their lodges, lest they end up torn to pieces in the frenzy. Which is all just to help show how their success as medicine men actually proved to be a terrifying, uncontrollable thing, even as their movement continued to build on itself into the fall of 1535 as it pushed further south, closer now than ever to the tiny Castilian settlement on the Rio Pánuco. But the expeditionaries' dozens of followers soon grew into hundreds. And now, it wasn't just the sick asking for their blessings, their entire flock came to expect them each day. Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Durantes, and Estevan were spending 3 hours a day, by their account, on blessings and cures. And yet, if we take them at their word, they were indeed producing some truly amazing cures. Somewhere around this time, they claimed to have cured an entire village afflicted by blindness, by, quote, clouded vision. I can't help but be reminded of a New Testament passage here, the line where John the Baptist's followers asked Jesus if he is the Messiah. As per usual, Jesus doesn't answer them directly. Instead, he tells them to go back and report everything he's done, which he helpfully summarizes for them. Quote, the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them, end quote. All of which are also things that these 4 expeditionaries have done by this point, if you're keeping track, except for making the deaf hear and maybe cleansing lepers. Though you might remember that earlier in his narrative, Cabeza de Vaca does compare the effects of mosquito bites on a person to a leper's open sores. And since he technically was the one protecting his masters from the mosquitoes back then, maybe you can come up with a convoluted way in which he was cleansing lepers back then, too. But then at some point, something starts to change in the character of their entourage. One day, their followers didn't wait for the 4 medicine men to redistribute their patients' payments to them. They just went up to the sick Indians that were coming before them and took what they were carrying. Quote, our followers became so many that we couldn't control them, end quote. The 4 expeditionaries also noticed that 6 guards had now been posted outside their lodges each night. Was this to protect them or to keep them from leaving? And the behavior of the crowd grew more aggressive each day. At the next village they entered, their entourage just preemptively ransacked it, taking all the possessions of everyone living there. Quote, those who came with us began to do much evil, taking away the livelihoods and sacking the homes of all who received us so well without leaving them anything. But we couldn't do anything about it, or punish those who acted so, and we had to suffer it until we might have more authority over them, end quote. They had lost control, it seems, of their own movement, and it was now running roughshod over the country. And yet, if we believe Cabeza de Vaca's account, the victims of this ransacking don't seem to mind. First, if nothing else, the 4 expeditionaries seemed to put on a good show, and the natives appreciated that. It had to be one of the most interesting things that had happened in a long time to the subsistence hunter-gatherers of the region. And second, the medicine men's cures worked, or at least they seemed to. Very few Cabeza de Vaca scholars believe that he's wholesale making up this idea of the cures. It's such a strange and unnecessarily bold lie during these years of the Spanish Inquisition that it would be an odd and frankly risky thing to invent. And there are enough other contemporary third-party accounts to lend pretty convincing credence to the fact that somehow, whatever the expeditionaries started doing around this time began to create for them a following of Native Americans that would allow them to continue moving forward across the continent in a way that they hadn't been able to for the previous 7 years. I find it unfortunate that we can't really tell what they're curing. We have one mention of blindness, which we heard earlier in this episode, And blindness is sometimes associated with smallpox, but the expeditionaries would have been able to diagnose that, and it seems like Cabeza de Vaca would have mentioned it in his account. So maybe, are they really curing physical blindness? Or is it some kind of spiritual blindness? We've seen them dealing with some kind of mysterious stomach ailment back on Galveston Island, and we heard about some fevers back in South Texas. At least one scholar has speculated that maybe they're healing typhus, which in this instance probably would have been a disease brought by Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions themselves. Are they actually spreading the diseases that their desperate patients are now asking them to cure? Well, it's hard to say. Cabeza de Vaca also mentions a different sickness. This one he calls modorra, which I'm told we might translate as lethargy. Are the natives of 16th century North America just depressed? Melancholy? Do they sense that they're living at a pivotal time and don't know how to deal with it? I don't have enough information to answer these questions, and I haven't seen the matter convincingly settled by any scholars on Cabeza de Vaca either. But I do feel comfortable concluding this. The 4 expeditionaries were clearly doing something to make the natives of South Texas and northern Mexico feel better, physically, spiritually, or whatever. Whether they were causing the diseases they were professing to cure, I don't know. But the consensus as well among the Native Americans at the time seems to be that they were doing more good than harm, because they continued to come from far and wide to see them, to be treated by them, and in many cases now, to join them on their journey across the continent. But as a businessman by day, I can't help but notice the incentives that the 4 expeditionaries inadvertently set up here that helped them on their journey, that aligned their interests with those of their followers in a way that gave their movement a momentum of its own. You have to kind of read between the lines to realize what it is, but here's Cabeza de Vaca talking about it indirectly. Quote, "Seeing our distress, even the Indians who lost everything consoled us that we shouldn't feel bad, because they were very happy just to have seen us, and that their possessions had been put to good use, and that they would be repaid by those further on who would make them very rich." End quote. The expeditionaries, it seems, had just unleashed the continent's first pyramid scheme. Yes, at each new village, the natives there were stripped of all their belongings, but then they were reassured that they'd soon be made whole simply by joining the movement and robbing the next village. It's a pretty economically devastating way to move across the country, but it had the very practical upside of making a lot of people around the 4 expeditionaries very invested in maintaining their aura as medicine men and keeping their show moving. In a kind of perverse way, it created something that the expeditionaries had never been able to create before: momentum. Recall that in the previous episode, Cabeza de Vaca had told us a folktale about a character who was essentially his evil doppelganger, roaming through the country terrorizing the natives. Perhaps not coincidentally, the raging mobs of their followers are the physical manifestation of their own potential for evil, which was something that they were struggling to come to terms with as their power as healers grew. And it was something that made the 4 expeditionaries realize that, in a very different way, they were once again just as out of control as they had been 2 years ago as slaves on the South Texas coast. And though they were happy to finally be moving, they were doubtful of whether their movement was taking them where they wanted to go. They decided that they needed to reestablish control of their movement. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache and was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andres Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.